Looking at the final classification of the 2025 Formula One Monaco Grand Prix, there is a figure that raises eyebrows at Ferrari: the 51 seconds lost by Lewis Hamilton to race winner Lando Norris, which become 48 seconds when compared to his Maranello teammate Charles Leclerc. A significant gap, the second worst of the season after the minute lost in the Miami Grand Prix. But while in that case the gap to Charles Leclerc was only a few seconds, about a minute behind the leader, highlighting how the root issue was an SF25 single-seater struggling on circuits that require aero-mechanical compromises in order to balance slow and fast corners. On the streets of Monte Carlo, the story is different. It is no secret that Charles Leclerc is one of the fastest drivers on street circuits, especially in his Monte Carlo home race, where results show he has always been able to take risks and extract something extra when it mattered the most, namely in terms of qualifying performance. Once again this year, his effectiveness on the Principality's narrow streets was most evident in qualifying, where Lewis Hamilton finished about 3/10 behind. On a track filled with slow corners, the British driver's most significant deficit over a single lap actually came in the faster sections, such as the entry to Maranello, as well as Casino and Tabac corners, which are sections requiring courage and precision to brush close to the walls while minimizing understeer. It is precisely in these areas that Lewis Hamilton's chronic lack of confidence in the front end became evident, as seen on other tracks too. Nevertheless, the SF25 car's good performance in the slow sections still allowed him to set the fourth fastest time in qualifying, which unfortunately turned into a 7th place on the grid after a penalty for impeding Max Verstappen. And it is clear that the penalty complicated his entire race on Sunday. In the first 17 laps of the Monaco Grand Prix, with Lewis Hamilton stuck in traffic behind Isaac Hadjar and Fernando Alonso due to the penalty, the 7-time Formula One world champion lost 15 seconds to Lando Norris, which is about a second per lap, while the gap to Charles Leclerc was just under 12 seconds. Once Fernando Alonso also pitted and Lewis Hamilton had a clear track to run in clean air, his lap times immediately improved, matching those of the race leaders. In the subsequent laps, during which the Briton attempted to complete the overcut on Isaac Hadjar and Fernando Alonso, the gap to the McLaren MCL39 of Lando Norris remained virtually unchanged. The problem was that by then, Lewis Hamilton was already out of contention for any real target. All the front-runners, from Lando Norris to Max Verstappen, had enough margin to pit and come out comfortably ahead of the Ferrari. Even Max Verstappen, for example, could manage his stop without pressure. Lewis Hamilton showed good pace at times, but backmarkers were a burden. If we examine the lap times from lap 20 to 29, when Lando Norris approached the backmarker traffic, Lewis Hamilton's gap to the Briton stayed mostly steady, rising to just under 16 seconds. Choosing to pit earlier and run with fresh tires for a few extra laps allowed the former Mercedes driver to reduce the gap to Charles Leclerc as well. But it was in this phase that the second major problem of his race emerged: traffic. While Lando Norris managed to clear the backmarker group from Carlos Sainz to Oliver Bearman in 2 or 3 laps, Lewis Hamilton took longer. This was also because Franco Colapinto and Gabriel Bortoleto had rejoined the back of the pack. Before encountering the backmarkers, the Ferrari driver was about 15 seconds behind Lando Norris. By the time he had cleared the entire group, the gap had risen to around 30 seconds. At that point, any hope of recovery had definitively vanished. Mid-race target from Ferrari also played a very important role for the outcome of the Monaco Grand Prix. At this stage, Lewis Hamilton began expressing concerns over the radio, asking his race engineer Riccardo Adami for more information about what was happening in the race. Analyzing the telemetry data regarding his pace in the next 10 laps, from when he returned to clean air until Lando Norris's second pit stop, the gap increased by about 5 seconds, with a pace delta of half a second per lap to Lando Norris and 4/10 to Charles Leclerc. However, there is a reason. Lewis Hamilton was simply following the 1:15.0 target time requested by Ferrari from lap 40 onward, which explains the significant delta. With nothing to lose, Ferrari opted to extend the middle stint, partially playing into Red Bull's hands, as it allowed Max Verstappen to stay safely out of undercut range despite the traffic. Ferrari did not attempt to apply pressure to force an undercut, not even after Lewis Hamilton's second stop, and this is likely where the greater miscommunication between driver and pit wall occurred. The Briton himself complained over the radio about the lack of information. Instead of pushing to put pressure on Max Verstappen, the first laps of the third and final stint were very slow, with Lewis Hamilton losing another 6 seconds to the front, adding to the time already lost by extending the stint compared to those who had already stopped for a second time. As Max Verstappen began to slow the group ahead, Lewis Hamilton once again found himself stuck in backmarker traffic, taking 6 laps to get through. The time lost early in the race due to the penalty, time lost in lapping slower cars, and far from perfect communication with the Ferrari pit wall all significantly contributed to the final 50-second gap at the end of the Monaco Grand Prix. It was a mostly solitary race for Lewis Hamilton in Monte Carlo, but it could hardly have been otherwise, especially after the 3-place grid penalty he received yesterday for impeding Max Verstappen in qualifying, due in part to a mistaken message from his race engineer Riccardo Adami. Starting from 7th is always a disadvantage, but even more so on a circuit like Monaco, where it is nearly impossible to change the course of a race that's all but predetermined in the absence of unexpected events. Although it is true that Lewis Hamilton didn't have Oscar Piastri's pace, a large part of the gap he accumulated to the Ferrari driver was built up during the traffic phase. To give an idea, Max Verstappen rejoined the track ahead of Lewis Hamilton with about a 3-second advantage. After clearing the back markers, the gap between the two had grown to as much as 15 seconds. Even though the Dutchman was on fresher and softer tires, this figure shows just how much Lewis's race slowed down during that phase, effectively ruling out any chance of fighting for a better position. The time lost also allowed Oscar Piastri to continue extending his stint until he had a safe enough margin to pit and still rejoin ahead. Analyzing Lewis Hamilton's pace compared to Max Verstappen, it wasn't that far off when he was in clean air, but the time lost in traffic and the grid penalty had a significant impact. Lewis Hamilton was in fact one of the last to pit, as the initial plan was to try to extend the stint and hope for a favorable incident. Given that Isaac Hadjar behind him was so far back, he did not pose a real threat. Essentially, Ferrari could play the strategic card and hope for a twist of fate, but even that last glimmer quickly faded. In the end, the British driver finished nearly 50 seconds behind the leader, having lost further time in traffic in a race that brought him only a 5th place and, above all, little excitement. One of the novelties introduced in Monaco this season was the double pit stop strategy, which in Lewis Hamilton's case did not really make a difference, except for the traffic caused by some teams swapping positions to slow down the pack. Sometimes luck helps, other times it doesn't. In the previous round, a well-timed virtual safety car had worked in his favor, allowing him to maximize a one-stop strategy. But since Imola, another factor has emerged, highlighted again after Saturday's qualifying session, namely the improved feeling with the SF25, even if this only translated into a 5th-place finish in Monte Carlo.